For 11 years, I read humanity's numbers into the record of the Vantic Accord, and for 11 years, no one in that chamber believed a single one of them was worth listening to. That was the point of me. Every seated body in the Accord kept a tally clerk of the species it governed, a living index that stood at the low rail and spoke the figures aloud when the registry called for them. Most clerks were of the governed species themselves, because the Accord found it satisfying to make a people recite their own limits. So I stood for Earth. Tomas Reed, accession clerk, third rank, seconded from the human mission to the tally office of the High Registry. My whole function was to keep the ledger of what humanity was permitted and to read from it when asked. I want to be honest about how small that made me feel, because the smallness matters to what came after. The registry chamber was built to make a person feel like an entry. It was a great pale bowl of tiered stone, ringed 9 levels deep with the seats of the Accord's members, and at its floor stood the registrar's dais, a slab of dark glass lit from beneath so the first registrar seemed to float on her own authority. The Ulven held that seat then, as they had for as long as the Accord had counted anything. Tall people, the Ulven, pale as candle fat, with long sloping skulls and hands that had one too many fingers. They did not raise their voices. They did not need to. They governed the settled galaxy the way a man governs a warehouse, by knowing what was in it and where. And in their ledger, humanity was a small consignment on a high shelf, gathering dust. We had come into the Accord's awareness late, and poorly, and by their reckoning we had never recovered from the impression. A single human survey ship had wandered across a Vantic range buoy some 60 years before I was born, low on fuel, its crew half-starved, begging by every protocol for the right to pass. The Accord had granted it, the way you grant a stray a bowl at the back step, and then it had done what the Accord did with every new species. It measured us. It counted our worlds, one at the time, and a scatter of thin colonies. It counted our hulls. It gauged our reach, the farthest a human ship had ever pushed from home, and it wrote that number down as the outer edge of what we were. Then it drew the ceiling. The ceiling was the Accord's oldest instrument and its favorite. For every governed species it fixed 2 figures, a tonnage limit, the total mass of warship-grade hull that species was permitted to hold, and a range writ, the farthest its vessels were permitted to travel from its home star without the registry's leave. The figures were reviewed each decade. A species that behaved, that stayed inside its numbers and paid its accession dues and sent its clerk to recite when called, might one day petition for a higher ceiling, might, in a century or 3, be raised from a governed people to a seated one. That was the promise the Accord dangled, and it was a real promise. A handful of species had climbed it. It took obedience measured in generations. Humanity had been given the lowest ceiling in the current ledger, 40 capital hulls, a range writ that did not reach past the 3rd shell of stars from Sol, and a file in the registrar's own hand that I had read once and never forgot because I was the one who kept it. It classified us under a Vantic word the translators rendered as aspirant. It meant, in their tongue, a thing still reaching, a people forever a little short of the shelf they wanted. In the margin, some Ulven hand 2 registrars dead had written a note the office found charming enough to preserve across the decades. They are always chasing, it said. They will chase until they die of it. I read that note the first week of my posting. I read it the way you read a thing about your own mother that you cannot answer. And then I did my job. Because that was the arrangement, and the arrangement had held for 2 human generations, and it was going to hold for 100 more. That was what I believed on the morning the registry convened to renew the ceiling, and to demand, for the first time in 40 years, a full accounting of the human fleet. I knew the session was different before I reached the low rail, because the galleries were full. The renewal of a governed species ceiling was ordinarily a tedious thing, a quarter-hour of ledger reading that half the seated bodies skipped. But word had gone through the Accord that the human question would be reopened in full this decade, and the seated species had come to watch. I climbed to my place at the rail and looked up the 9 tiers and saw them all, the Ulvain on the dais and the front benches, and behind them the whole gaudy census of the governed galaxy's masters. The Corvin who breathed through the plates of their own armor, the Sethiel, small and quick and four-armed, scholars of the ledger, the Dramer, whose great gray bodies filled 2 seats each and who governed by weight of presence alone, 100 species, 1,000 counselors, and every one of them there for the same reason people slow their vehicles past a wreck. The human delegation was 3. That was all the range writ permitted for a governed species at a renewal, 3, and a clerk. They came in through the low door and crossed the floor of the bowl on foot, the long way, under the eyes of the tiers, and I watched the galleries do what galleries always did to us. They did not jeer. The accord was too orderly for that. They simply looked at 3 small figures crossing a floor built to shrink them, and they settled back into their seats with the satisfaction of people whose expectations are about to be confirmed. At the head of the 3 walked our first envoy. Her name was Mara Hale, and she was old in the way that a keel is old, worn smooth and gone hard. Gray hair cut plain, a dark coat with no insignia because humanity's mission wore no rank the accord would recognize. She had been envoy for 19 years. She had stood on that floor and recited humanity's dues and accepted humanity's limits more times than any clerk could count, and in all those years I had never once seen her plead. That was the thing about Hale that the accord mistook for weakness. She never argued. A species that argues believes it can change the ledger. Hale had long ago stopped behaving like a woman who believed that. She reached the low rail, and she inclined her head to the dais the exact degree the protocol required, no more, and she stood. The first registrar rose. Her name in the record was Osavain, and she was the 7th of her line to hold the seat. She lifted one long pale hand, and the chamber quieted, and she began to read the human file into the record in the flat liturgical cadence the Ulvain used for governance, the cadence of a woman reading an inventory she has read 1,000 times. The consignment of Earth, she said, governed species 3rd classification, aspirant, present ceiling, 40 capital hulls, range writ to the 3rd shell. She let the numbers hang a moment in the great bowl. The accord convenes to review. The review will proceed in the customary order. The clerk of Earth will read the declared holdings. That was me. I opened the ledger. I want to describe the ledger because everything turns on it. It was not paper. It was a slab of the same dark glass as the dais, and it held every hull humanity had declared to the accord across 2 generations, every keel laid and every keel scrapped, every range filing, every dutiful little submission the human mission had made to keep itself inside the lines. I had kept it current with my own hands. When Earth built a ship, Earth told me, and I entered it, and the number never once climbed past 40. When a ship went to the breakers, I struck it. The ledger was clean. It was, I would have sworn on the graves of my whole family, complete and true. I read it. 38 capital hulls in current service, 2 in refit, range filings all inside the 3rd shell, accession dues paid in full to the current quarter. I read the numbers into the great bowl in the flat voice they had trained into me, and I heard up in the tiers the small settling sounds of 1,000 counselors receiving exactly the numbers they had expected. 38 of a permitted 40. A people right up against its ceiling and pressing, always pressing, and never once getting through. Aspirant still reaching, chasing. The first registrar received the reading, and then she did the thing that made the galleries lean forward, the thing they had come to see. The accord notes the declaration, she said. The accord does not renew on the declaration alone. A stir went through the tiers. I felt my own stomach drop because I knew the words that were coming and I knew what they meant. For 40 years, Osavain said, the sealing of Earth has been renewed upon the word of Earth's own clerk. This is the customary courtesy the accord extends to a species that has given no cause for concern. She paused, and her long head turned slowly toward the human delegation. The accord withdraws the courtesy. It will renew the sealing of Earth upon inspection. A registry survey party will enter the Sol shell and each shell within the range writ, and it will count every hull, every yard, every keel laid or hidden. The declared ledger will be measured against the found ledger, and the ceiling will be set upon what is found. She let the sentence land in the silence of a chamber that understood exactly what it meant. An inspection, not a formality, a physical audit of everything humanity held, carried out by the Accord's own surveyors, with the human mission required by treaty to open every door. And I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, standing at the low rail with the true and complete ledger open under my hand, because it was not fear. I had kept that ledger clean for 11 years. I knew what was in it. I felt, God help me, a kind of grim relief. Let them come and count, I thought. Let them count 38 hulls and go home and leave us to chase our stars in peace. Let them find the ledger true. I looked up at Envoy Hale to see how she would take it. She had not moved. She stood at the rail with her hands loose at her sides and her plain gray head level, and she was looking up at the dais with an expression I had seen on her exactly once before, years earlier, at a much smaller session, and had never understood. It was not the face of a woman who had just been threatened. It was the face of a woman who had been waiting a very long time for something, and had just heard it arrive. "The mission of Earth accepts the inspection," she said. That was all. No argument, no plea for the courtesy to be extended one more decade, no reminder of 40 years of good conduct. She accepted it the way you accept a thing you asked for. The first registrar's head tilted a fraction, and I have thought about this many times since, that some old instinct in her, some warehouse keeper's sense that a consignment was sitting wrong on the shelf, stirred at that answer and then lay back down. Because acceptance was what obedient species gave. Hale had given the correct response. It would have been unreasonable, would it not, for the correct response to be the first sign of trouble. "The Accord notes the acceptance," Ossivane said. "The survey party will make for the Sol shell. The renewal stands adjourned until it returns with the found ledger." She lifted her hand to close the session, and Envoy Hale, who never spoke twice, spoke twice. "First Registrar," she said, "one correction to the record before your surveyors go." The hand stopped. Up and down the tiers, the small sound stopped. A governed clerk correcting the record was ordinary. A governed envoy correcting the first registrar was very close to the edge of what the protocol allowed, and everyone in that bowl knew it. "The mission's clerk read the declared holdings," Hale said, and her voice had not risen at all. It had only gone very even, very clear, so that it carried up all 9 tiers without effort. "He read them true. 38 hulls, 2 in refit, all inside the range writ. He keeps an honest ledger, and I would not have him thought otherwise when your surveyors come back." She paused. "But the declared ledger and the found ledger will not agree. I am telling you that now, in the record, so that no one accuses this man of a lie he did not tell." The silence in the chamber changed its quality. It went from the silence of a room hearing a formality to the silence of a room hearing something it does not have a category for. "Explain the discrepancy," said Ossivane. "I will let your surveyors explain it," Hale said. "That is what they are for. I ask only that the record show I told you first." And she inclined her head the correct degree, and she stood back, and she said nothing more. I stood at the low rail with the ledger open under my hand and my whole face gone cold, because I did not understand what she meant, and because I had a sudden and terrible certainty that I was the only person in the Accord who had believed the ledger true, and that I had been reading a lie into the record of the galaxy for 11 years without knowing it. The survey took 91 days. I was required to travel with it. The clerk of a species under inspection went with the surveyors to open the ledger against the found holdings and to answer for any discrepancy. I had never left the registry world in 11 years. I went home to the Sol shell for the first time since I was a young man, in the belly of a Vantic survey cruiser, at the low rail of a smaller chamber, and I watched the Accord count my people. The surveyor in command was a Sethiel named Kesh, one of the small, quick, four-armed scholars, and I will say this for Kesh. It was not cruel, and it was not lazy. It was a creature of the ledger in the purest sense, a being that believed the found number was the only truth there was, and it went about finding the number with a thoroughness I could not fault. We began at Earth. Kesh's surveyors counted the yards of Earth and the orbital docks, and the hulls in service and the hulls in refit. And at the end of 11 days at Earth, the found ledger read 38 capital hulls and 2 in refit. And Kesh looked at me with its head cocked and said, in the flat trade tongue, "The declaration of Earth is true." I remember the relief. I remember thinking Hale had misspoken or tested them or played some envoy's game I was too small to follow. I said, "Yes, it is true." "At Earth," said Kesh. Then we went out. I had never been past the second shell. My whole life had been the registry world and Earth, the clerk's 2 poles. Kesh took the survey out along the range writ, shell by shell, to the third shell where the writ ended, and it counted the human colonies there. The thin scatter the Accord had measured 60 years before and filed as the outer edge of what we were. And the colonies were there, but they were not thin. I want to be careful here, because what I saw over those 91 days I saw as a clerk sees, one number at a time, and the horror of it. I use the word horror for what Kesh felt, because I felt something else. The horror of it built the way a column of figures builds, digit by digit, until you reach the bottom and see the total. The colonies of the third shell were not the frontier the Accord had filed. They were old. They had cities under domes that had been standing for 50 years. They had yards, small yards, civilian yards, nothing that counted as capital hull tonnage, all of it perfectly and scrupulously inside the ceiling. But they had a great many of them, and they were busy, and they were building things that were not warships and had never been declared because the ceiling only counted warships. They were building range. They were building drive cores and long-haul freighters, and the patient, unglamorous infrastructure of a people that had decided, quietly, 2 generations ago, that the shape of the Accord's ceiling had a hole in it, and had walked through the hole without ever once crossing the line the ceiling actually drew. The ceiling counted capital hulls. It counted warship tonnage. It did not count how far a civilian ship might go, so long as the ship itself was filed inside the range writ. And humanity had filed every ship inside the range writ. Every ship the Accord could see had stayed inside the lines. But a range writ measures where a ship is permitted to go. It cannot measure where a ship has already been, if the ship came home before anyone counted it. Kesh found the first of them in the third shell, a returned survey vessel, civilian, filed and legal, sitting in dock at a colony yard. Kesh's surveyors, being thorough, read its drive log because the ledger of a ship is not only its declaration but its history. And Kesh went very still in the way of the Sethiel, all 4 hands folding down flat. The ship had been to the 11th shell. Not the 3rd, where the writ ended. The 11th. 8 shells past the farthest edge the Accord had ever permitted a human vessel to reach, past ranges the Accord itself did not routinely travel. Out into the dark the Vantic ledger simply left blank because nothing the Accord governed had ever needed to go there. And it had gone, and it had come back, and it had filed itself as a legal civilian vessel inside the range writ, and it had told no one, because no one had asked the one question that would have revealed it. No one had asked a human ship where it had already been. That was the first, it was not the last. Over the 91 days, Kesh's surveyors read the logs of every returned hull they could find. And the pattern came up out of the numbers the way a coastline comes up out of a fog. Humanity had been going out for 2 generations. Not in warships, never one hull over the ceiling, but in the patient civilian fleet that the ceiling did not count, and the Accord had never thought to fear. They had gone out past the 3rd shell and the 5th and the 9th. They had found worlds. They had, in the quiet, unglamorous human way, settled some of them. Small, deep, hidden settlements far outside any shell the Accord surveyed, filed nowhere, declared to no one, because the treaty required humanity to declare its ships and its capital tonnage, and it had declared every one of those with perfect honesty. The treaty had never required humanity to declare where its ships had been, or what they had built where no Vantic surveyor would ever look. We had not been chasing the stars. We had been quietly reaching them, one honest legal ship at a time, for 60 years, while a clerk read 38 hulls into the record and a chamber full of masters settled back and smiled. I understood it somewhere around the 51st day, sitting at the low rail of Kesh's survey chamber while it read out the drive log of the 9th returned hull. I understood that the ledger I had kept clean for 11 years had been true in every line and false in its whole. Every number I had read was correct. The picture every number built was a lie humanity had let the Accord draw for itself, because the Accord had drawn it and had never thought to check, and a people that has decided to go somewhere does not always announce it. Sometimes it simply keeps its papers in order and goes. Kesh finished the 9th log and folded its hands and turned its small head to me, and for the first time in 91 days, the surveyor did not look like a creature of the ledger. It looked like a creature that had discovered the ledger was a room with no far wall. "Clerk of Earth," it said, "how far does it go?" And I, who had kept humanity's numbers for 11 years and had believed I knew them, said the only honest thing I had. "I don't know," I said. "I never counted the ships that came home." The registry reconvened on the 94th day. The galleries were fuller than before, because word travels, and the word that had traveled ahead of the survey cruiser was that the human question had gone wrong in a way no one could yet name. I climbed to my place at the low rail, and I saw the tiers packed 9 deep and silent, and I saw the human delegation cross the floor again, 3 figures and a clerk, the same as before, and I saw that nothing about them had changed at all, and that the not changing was the most frightening thing in the room. Envoy Hale reached the rail and inclined her head the correct degree. The first registrar rose. She had the found ledger before her. I could see it glowing in the dark glass of the dais, Kesh's survey rendered into the flat figures the Accord trusted above all things. She was a creature of the ledger too, Osivane, 7th of her line, and I watched her read the found number, and I watched the number do to her what it had done to Kesh, except that Kesh had had 91 days to absorb it, and the first registrar had it all at once. "The survey of Earth is returned," she said. Her voice was still flat, still liturgical, but it was working now to stay that way, and everyone in the bowl could hear the work. "The Accord will hear the found ledger." Kesh gave the found ledger. It stood on the survey floor and it read in the flat scholar's cadence the true holdings of humanity as its surveyors had found them. And I will not set down every figure because the figures went on for a long time and the chamber changed with each one. It read the capital hulls, 38 in service, 2 in refit, all inside the ceiling. A murmur of relief in the tiers at that, the last relief the Accord would feel. Then it read the civilian fleet, the true size of it, and the murmur stopped. Then it read the yards, the true number of them, scattered across shells the Accord had filed as empty. Then it read the range logs. It read the 11th shell. It read the settlements past the surveyed dark, the ones with no filing and no declaration and no line in any ledger the Accord kept, because the Accord kept ledgers of what it governed and it had never governed those. It read for a long time, and with every figure the great pale bowl of the chamber grew quieter and colder, until Kesh reached the bottom of the column and stopped, and there was no sound in the registry of the Vantic Accord at all. The first registrar sat with the found ledger glowing under her long pale hands. When she spoke, she did not speak to Kesh. She spoke to the human envoy, and she abandoned the liturgical cadence entirely, and that abandonment was itself a kind of surrender, because the cadence was the Accord's authority and she set it down. "You held the ceiling," Osivane said. "Every capital hull for 60 years, not one over." "Not one over," Hale agreed. "And in 60 years you settled 100 worlds we cannot count, past ranges we do not travel, and you declared none of them." "You never asked for them," Hale said. The treaty requires us to declare our ships and our warship tonnage. We have declared every ship and every ton honestly for 2 generations. It does not require us to declare our destinations. We read the treaty closely. It is a very good treaty. We have never broken it once. I stood at the low rail and I understood then the face I had seen on Marahale twice in my life. The day the inspection was ordered, and years before at a smaller session. It was the face of a woman who had known this day would come, who had perhaps helped design the long, patient silence that would make it come, and who had waited 19 years as envoy and 2 generations, as a people for the moment when the Accord's own surveyors would carry the truth into the chamber, so that humanity would never have to boast of it. We had not needed to declare what we had built. We had only needed to keep our papers in perfect order and wait for the Accord to grow curious. The inspection had not caught us. We had let the inspection find us. There is a difference, and the difference was the whole of the thing. "The ceiling," said the first registrar, and I heard, under the flat words, something I had never heard in that chamber in 11 years, which was a person reaching for an instrument and finding it was not there. The ceiling was to be set upon what is found. "Yes," Hale said. "There is no ceiling that fits what is found." "No," Hale said, "there isn't." She let that stand. She did not press it. She had never in 19 years pressed anything, and she did not begin now, and I understood that too, that the whole force of the moment lay in her not pressing it, in leaving the first registrar alone with a number that could not be governed and letting Osavane arrive, in her own time, at the only conclusion the ledger permitted. The Accord governed by knowing what was in the warehouse. Humanity had quietly, legally, over 60 patient years, become larger than the warehouse. And it had done so without a single hull over the ceiling, without a single broken clause, without a single word of threat, so that on the day the truth came out there was nothing for the Accord to punish and no line for it to point to. Only a ledger that had grown a total the registrar could not close her hand around. "What is it you want?" Osavane said at last, and the question itself was the surrender, because the Accord did not ask a governed species what it wanted. It told a governed species what it was permitted. And here is the moment I have carried with me, the moment the whole chamber leaned toward 9 tiers of the galaxy's masters waiting to hear what a people that had outgrown its keepers would finally demand. This was where a lesser envoy would have made the speech. This was where the human would have risen and told the Accord what humanity was, and what it had done, and what it would now require. Hale had every right to it. She had the found ledger, and the silent chamber, and 60 years of contempt to answer. She said none of it. "Nothing," Marahale said. The word went out into the great pale bowl and no one understood it, and she let them fail to understand it, and then she gave them the only sentence she would give. "We don't want a higher ceiling," she said. "We're not asking to be seated. We stopped chasing that a long time ago." She paused, and her plain gray head lifted the smallest degree. "We only kept our papers in order so that on the day you finally looked, you'd see we never lied to you, and you'd have to sit with the rest yourselves. That was all." She inclined her head the correct degree to the dais. She gave them even that, even now, and she stood back from the rail. And she was done. I have tried many times to describe what happened in the chamber then, and I have never managed it because nothing happened, and the nothing was enormous. The Accord governed by the ledger, and the ledger had just told it that the smallest consignment on the highest shelf had, without ever breaking a rule, become something the shelf could not hold. There was no clause to invoke. There was no punishment to assign. There was no threat to answer because the human had made none. There was only a chamber full of the galaxy's masters sitting with a number, and the slow, cold understanding of who, across 60 years, had actually been standing still, who had been settled and satisfied and sure, counting the same 40 hulls each decade, and who had been going out, and out, and out, into a dark the masters had never bothered to map because nothing they governed had ever wanted it. I looked at the file on my ledger, at the note the Accord had preserved across the decades because it found it charming. They are always chasing. They will chase until they die of it. And I closed the file because it was no longer true, and it had perhaps never been true, and it seemed to me at that moment that the truest thing in the whole chamber was that the people who had written it had never once thought to ask where the chase had gone. The first registrar closed the session. She did not renew the sealing. She could not. There was no found number to set it against. She adjourned the human question indefinitely, which in the Accord's long, cautious language meant that the Accord did not know what humanity was any more and would need a very long time to decide, and until it decided it would do the one thing it had never done in 2 generations, which was to leave us alone. Envoy Hale crossed the floor of the bowl for the last time, the long way, under the eyes of the tears. And the tears did not settle back into their seats with satisfaction. They watched 3 small figures walk out of a chamber built to shrink them, and this time the chamber did not shrink them at all. I stayed on as clerk for 2 more years, and then I asked to be relieved, and I went out. I had spent my whole life reading humanity's numbers into a room that thought it knew what they meant, and I found, when the counting was over, that I did not want to keep any more ledgers. I took passage on one of the long civilian haulers, the patient unglamorous kind that the Accord had never counted, out past the 3rd shell and the 9th and the 11th, to one of the deep quiet settlements that had sat all those years in a dark no surveyor would look at, waiting under its dome for no one in particular to notice it was there. I am there now, an old man, writing this down, because the young people here do not know the story and should. They were born past every shell the Accord ever drew. They have never in their lives been called aspirant. They do not know what it is to stand at a low rail and read your own limits into a room that smiles at you, and I hope they never learn, and I write this so that if they ever do, they will know the answer their grandparents gave. We did not answer contempt with contempt. We did not make the speech. We kept our papers in order and we went out, one honest ship at a time, for 60 years, and we let the people who filed us under chasing keep their comfortable file until the day their own surveyors carried the truth into their own chamber and set it down in front of them where they could not look away. They thought we were chasing spaceships. We had already passed them. We only waited all those years for the Accord to grow curious enough to look up and see the dark we had gone out into while it was counting, and understand at last that the chase it had written into our file had never been ours. It had been theirs. They simply hadn't known yet that they'd lost.